Sarah May clutched the faded letter in her weathered hands, the ink barely visible after years of folding and unfolding. The words from her brother back east had promised so much when she and Thomas first set out for the Oregon Territory 3 years ago. Land of opportunity, he'd written. A place where a man can make something of himself. But standing here in the doorway of their half-built cabin, watching storm clouds gather over the wheat field that had failed for the 2nd year running, those promises felt as distant as the stars. Thomas was out there somewhere in those fields, probably cursing the sky again, shaking his fist at the heavens like that would somehow change their circumstances. She'd watched him do it so many times now that she'd lost count. Her husband had always been a fighter, never one to back down from a challenge. But lately his fighting looked more like flailing, and his determination had curdled into something bitter and desperate. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on their porch, and Sarah May pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. She thought about her mother back in Missouri, who used to say that worry was like sitting in a rocking chair. It gave you something to do but didn't get you anywhere. Easy words to remember, harder words to live by when you're watching everything you've worked for slip through your fingers like dust in a drought. She remembered the day they'd first laid eyes on this land. Thomas had been so sure, so confident as he walked the boundaries, talking about the house they'd build, the crops they'd grow, the children who would play in these very fields. He'd knelt right there by that old oak tree and prayed, thanking God for the blessing of this new beginning. That was before the grasshoppers came the first summer, before the creek dried up, before old Henrik down the valley warned them about the winter winds that could strip paint off a barn door. Now Thomas barely prayed at all except to ask God why he'd led them out here just to watch them fail. Sarah May had tried to tell him what her grandmother used to say about letting go and letting God, but Thomas would just look at her with those tired eyes and ask if God was going to pay their debts or plant their crops or fix the roof before the next storm hit. She didn't have answers for those questions, at least not the kind of answers Thomas wanted to hear. But she was beginning to understand something that she couldn't quite put into words yet, something about the difference between doing your part and trying to do God's part. The sound of hoofbeats on the dirt road pulled her from her thoughts. A rider was approaching, and as he got closer, she could see it was young Benjamin Fletcher from the settlement. His horse looked like it had been ridden hard, and Benjamin's face carried the kind of urgency that usually meant bad news. "Mrs. Patterson," Benjamin called as he dismounted near their gate. "Is Thomas about? I've got word from town." Sarah May felt her stomach drop. "What kind of word, Benjamin?" "The bank's called in the Morrison loan. They're losing the farm and Morrison owes Thomas for that wheat delivery last month. Word is Morrison can't pay anybody right now. The money Thomas was counting on, the money they needed to make it through winter, was gone." Just like that. Sarah May felt the familiar tightness in her chest, that feeling like she couldn't quite catch her breath. But underneath the fear, something else stirred, something that surprised her with its steadiness. "Thomas is out in the south field," she told Benjamin. "You'll find him by the creek bed." After Benjamin rode off, Sarah May walked back into the cabin and sat at the rough-hewn table. Thomas had built their first winter here. The wood was scarred from 3 years of hard use, but it was solid, sturdy, like Thomas himself, she supposed, like the faith she'd been raised on but had somehow misplaced somewhere between leaving Missouri and watching dreams crumble in Oregon dirt. She thought about Mary Whitman, a woman she'd known briefly at the trading post in Independence. Mary had lost her first husband to fever on the trail, but she'd kept going with her 3 children, eventually remarrying a widower named Samuel and starting over in California. Sarah May had always wondered how Mary found the strength to keep moving forward when everything fell apart. Now she was beginning to understand that maybe strength wasn't about holding everything together, maybe it was about knowing when to stop trying to hold everything together. When Thomas came back an hour later, his face was grim but not surprised. Bad news had a way of finding them before anyone could deliver it proper. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and slumped into the chair across from her. "Morrison can't pay," he said. It wasn't a question. Benjamin Fletcher brought word. Thomas stared at his hands, calloused and cracked from years of fighting this land. "I keep trying to figure out what I did wrong, Sarah May. Keep thinking if I'd planted different crops or fixed the irrigation sooner, or negotiated better prices in town, and what have you figured out? He looked up at her and she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in months. Not hope exactly, but maybe the absence of that bitter anger that had been eating at him. That maybe I've been trying to do too much on my own. Sarah May reached across the table and took his hand. Tell me what you mean. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than it had been in a long time. Remember when we first got here, how everything seemed like God had led us here for a purpose, and all I had to do was work hard and everything would fall into place. But when things started going wrong, I guess I figured it was up to me to fix them. All of them, every problem, every setback, every disappointment. And now I'm thinking maybe God's purpose for us being here isn't what I thought it was. Maybe it's not about succeeding the way I planned. Maybe it's about learning something I couldn't learn anywhere else. Sarah May felt something loosen in her chest, like a knot she'd been carrying for months finally coming undone. What kind of something? Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the land that had both blessed and broken them. Learning to trust when I can't see the whole picture. Learning that doing my best doesn't mean trying to control everything. Learning that maybe God's timing and God's ways aren't always what I expect them to be. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally broke, sending rain against the windows in heavy sheets. But for the first time in months, the sound didn't make Sarah May worry about the roof leaking or the crops flooding. She found herself thinking instead about how the earth needed the rain, even when it came at inconvenient times. So what do we do now? She asked. Thomas turned back to her and she saw something in his face that reminded her of the man who had first asked her to marry him, the man who had believed in possibilities and adventures and the goodness of taking chances. We do what we can do and we stop trying to do what we can't. We trust that God's got a plan even when we can't see past tomorrow. Even if it means losing the farm. Even if it means losing the farm, though I'm not ready to give up just yet. But I'm ready to give up trying to carry the whole world on my shoulder. Over the next few weeks, something shifted in their little cabin. Thomas still worked from dawn to dusk, still worried about money and weather and 100 other things, but he'd stopped carrying them all like personal failure. When the Hendersons from down the valley stopped by to say they were heading back east, defeated by the same struggles that had been plaguing the Pattersons, Thomas listened with compassion instead of defensiveness. When the Kowarskis needed help bringing in their hay crop, he spent 2 days working their fields even though his own work was pressing. You know what I realized? Sarah May said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. I've been so afraid of what might happen that I forgot to pay attention to what is happening. Thomas nodded. What do you see when you look around now? She gazed out at their land, seeing it with different eyes than she had just weeks before. I see a creek that runs clean even in dry years. I see soil that's rich even when the crops fail. I see neighbors who help each other and a community that's growing stronger, not just bigger. I see a husband who's learning to be gentle with himself, and She paused, placing her hand on her stomach with a small smile. I see reasons to hope that I hadn't noticed before. Thomas looked at her sharply. Sarah May, are you saying? I'm saying that maybe God's timing is different from ours, and maybe his gifts come in ways we don't expect. That night as they lay in bed listening to the owls calling across the valley, Thomas spoke into the darkness. I used to think faith meant believing that everything would work out the way I wanted it. Now I'm thinking maybe faith means believing that everything will work out the way it's supposed to, even if I can't understand it yet. Sarah May reached for his hand. And maybe faith means doing our part and trusting God to do his part instead of trying. The next morning brought news that old man Morrison had found a buyer for part of his land, enough to pay his debts, including what he owed Thomas. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to see them through the winter and give them a chance to plant again in the spring. But the real change wasn't in their circumstances, it was in how they faced their circumstances. When the first frost came early and damaged their late crop, Thomas assessed the loss calmly and started planning for next season. When Sarah May's pregnancy made her sick for weeks, they accepted help from neighbors without feeling like failures. When a letter came from back east saying that Thomas's father was ill, they prayed about it and decided to stay put rather than rushing back out of guilt and fear. Winter came hard that year, as Henrik had warned it would. But inside their cabin, warmed by a fire that burned steady and true, Sarah May and Thomas found a peace they hadn't known they were looking for. They read to each other in the evenings, shared stories about the baby coming in spring, and made plans that included room for change and uncertainty. You know what I've learned about worry? Sarah May said one snowy evening as she worked on baby clothes and Thomas mended harness leather by the fire.
What's that?
Worry is what happens when I try to live in tomorrow instead of today, when I try to solve problems that haven't happened yet, or control things that are outside my reach. Thomas set down his work and looked at her. And what have you learned about trust? Trust is what happens when I remember that God sees the whole story, not just the chapter I'm living in right now. When I remember that He's got more invested in our good than we do, and He's got more resources to draw on than we can imagine. The baby was born on a warm April morning, healthy and strong, with Thomas's determined chin and Sarah May's steady eyes. They named him David, after the shepherd boy who faced giants, with nothing but faith and a smooth stone. As Sarah May held her son and watched Thomas's face transform with wonder and love, she thought about all the things she'd worried about that had never come to pass, and all the blessings that had come that she'd never thought to hope for. The farm still struggled, but it survived. They still faced setbacks and disappointments, but they faced them differently. Thomas still worked hard, but he'd learned the difference between diligence and desperation. Sarah May still planned and hoped, but she'd learned to hold her plans lightly and her hopes with open hands. Years later, when young couples would stop by asking for advice about making it on the frontier, Sarah May would tell them about the difference between doing your part and trying to do God's. She'd tell them about the peace that comes from working hard and trusting deep, about the way worry shrinks when you stop trying to see around every corner and start paying attention to where you are right now. But mostly, she'd tell them what she'd learned that stormy afternoon when everything looked impossible. That God's timing isn't always our timing, His ways aren't always our ways, but His love is always His love, and that love can be trusted to work all things together for good, even when we can't see. Sometimes the most profound faith is found not in the moment when everything goes right, but in the quiet choice to stop worrying about everything that might go wrong, and to trust that in God's hands, even our struggles are writing a story more beautiful than we could have imagined on our own.